Our passage this morning is a single passage that refers to Jesus' youth. I'm sure Jesus is happy he only had one passage like most of us would be. Now, every year, Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up as usual. And as it ended, they started to return. Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but his parents didn't know it entirely, assuming that he was part of the big pack of people traveling with them. They started to look for him among the relatives and friends and couldn't find him. And returning, they finally found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to the rabbis and answering their questions, asking them intelligent questions as well. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding. And when his parents saw him, they were perplexed. His mother said to him, "Child, you've treated us like this. Why? Look, your father and I have been searching for you with great worry and anxiety." And he said to them, "Why were you searching for me? Did you not know that I need to be in God's house?" But they didn't understand what he said. And then he went back with them to Nazareth and was obedient. And his mother treasured all these things in her heart. And Jesus increased in wisdom and in years and in divine and human favor alike. You know, the Gospels are not history books. They're literary forms. So we don't really know what Jesus' youth was like. We just have this one passage that foreshortens the time between Jesus' birth and when he appeared on the social scene in Jerusalem as a 30-year-old fiery prophet. Our passage is full of symbols that anticipate the themes that will make up his message and his death, not unlike the paintings of the Renaissance with the Madonna and Child. And one of my favorites, Leonardo da Vinci, has this beautiful portrait of a young woman, and she has an infant on her lap, the baby Jesus. And Mary is so full of that warm, humane love that mothers the world over beam at their miracle children just after they're born when they hold them on their lap. And the baby Jesus is playfully exploring the world, shrouded in this warm comfort that his mother surrounds him with. And in his hand, he holds a spindle. It's one of the most ordinary household items in a typical Italian home in the 1500s. Women used it to spin wool and make clothes for their children. Baby Jesus has turned the spindle in just the right direction so that the discerning eye can see that there's a cross that he's holding, an ordinary device but turned to a symbolic one. The perceptive will see the arc of tragedy woven into the life of this child in a way that the Madonna could not see and certainly the child could not anticipate. And looking back, our lives are often like that, aren't they? It's almost like you should have seen this coming. You could have seen this coming if only you could see. The Gospels tell us all we need to know about Jesus' youth, and it foreshadows his life and work in this one simple story. He was a pretty ordinary boy. His parents made a 120-mile journey, and half the time they can't find Jesus because he's running ahead or lagging behind. My grandchildren live with this year, 6 of them. I wake up most mornings and watch my daughter corral 4 boys and 2 girls to eat breakfast, brush their teeth, get dressed, pack their lunch, comb their hair, and get out of the house. Most every morning, one of my grandsons is beating the fire out of his brother, and his brother is shrieking for justice. Sometimes the adults respond, sometimes not. You know, you cajole, you shush, you threaten, you push them in the right direction, and finally, you just have to start the car and get moving, right? My favorite image of this cacophony is seeing the baby, Michael is about 2 years of age, running after the car is driven about 20 yards down the road before anyone realizes that he's not even with them. But who hasn't had a maddening teenager that runs ahead on the platform and jumps on the subway before you're even sure you can actually make it onto the C train with your younger kids? You'd like to brain them this one time. And having grandchildren, again, I forget just how much of our time is spent trying to get these people to follow some basic rules, boys especially. I think it's one of the unspoken reasons sports are so popular these days. It gives boys structure, and it seems to be the one of the very few things that motivate them to actually follow through. Jesus' youth was ordinary. He was a roughhouser. He was not where he was supposed to be. And here's the thing for the discerning eye, those with a transcendent perspective. He isn't going to be where you'd expect him to show up. He'll be somebody that's out of the box, and we admire that quality in other people's children, right? It's like the New Yorker cartoon with that guy talking to his new kitten standing in a brand new litter box, probably day one. The guy says to the cat, "Never, never, never think outside the box." Jesus isn't where he's supposed to be, and he probably never will be. His parents are looking for him irate, ready to read him the riot act on safety in the midst of large crowds, in the midst of large cities. They find him in the temple studying, and he's precocious. And he says something a teenager would never say. Don't you know this is where I need to be in God's house? But looking back and knowing what we will later learn, Jesus will strive his whole life to embody God's will in his life and not really worry too much about tradition or the rules of religion or deference to unjust political power. He will be way more daring than most of us would ever consider being. But you know, there's something profound about this quality of his life, because it's a nagging, profound question that you pose for yourself, don't you? Where do you need to be? Mandy Simmons had just finished packing up the car in front of her in-laws' vacation home in Vermont. She went for a jog as her husband socialized with his siblings, and her kids were idling their time with the cousins in front of video games. Images flashed through her mind of the past few days, the absence of her sister-in-law, now that she was proceeding with a divorce, and how much she missed her companionship and the furtive asides that they could share about the eccentricities of the family that they had both married into. Her father-in-law was ailing, and this was the first year that her mother-in-law had become something of a dominating presence as a result, setting an agenda without her husband's moderating influence or his warm humor. And her husband been off with his siblings for the last few days, having a great time to be sure, but also cavorting around the retreat house that he'd grown up, reliving past glories and indiscretions of his youth, kind of like an older version of her other teenage children. And she didn't like the way that her children were becoming more materialistic every year in the presence of their cousins, all of them comparing the relative perks of their lives in casual conversation that encouraged everyone to brag about who had more and who's had better lives as a result. They just weren't focused on things that mattered. She stood outside this beautiful, classic home, snow adrift like a postcard around the frozen maple trees, looking into the window of this place that she had seen in the spring, in the fall, in the winter over so many years of her life. And the car was packed up with all the special things that she'd brought to make the season so special. And she was so good at doing all of those little things that gave these reunions an extra flair. She was watching her breath in the cold, feeling a little lightheaded and refreshed, like maybe the cold had cleared her mind. She was thinking about the role that she played in the world with her family, the role that she played even at work, moderating difficult egos in a difficult setting, working behind the scenes to fend off potential troubles, figuring out a compromise before most people were able to see in the world what it should be, following through and worrying so much behind the scenes that she never really shared this part of herself with any other people, and it was exhausting. And then here she is doing it again during the holidays. And for a moment, she found herself just zooming out. It was like she could see the roles that she played, and then behind those roles, there was her actual self. And she was thinking to herself about how much more there was to her than the roles that other people saw her playing. And she worried that these roles were consuming so much of her that it was truncating who she really was and what she could actually become if she didn't have to spend so much time doing what other people thought she was supposed to do. And for a moment, right there out of the blue, she was filled with an aching loneliness. In the midst of all this family and all these people, Spiritual lens on her life zoomed out fast enough that she started to feel a little physical vertigo. She was awash in sadness that seemed to well up from somewhere really deep. And for a minute, it felt like it just might consume her completely. She reached for her heart to check her pulse and consciously tried to focus on feeling her feet on the ground again, waiting for this wave to pass. And she looked out, wiped her eyes like she was talking to her guardian angel, like she was talking to God, and said out loud, I'm not doing this anymore. Sometimes resolve settles on us like that. I've been existing on fulfilling what I'm supposed to do, and I'm really good at it. And it's not enough. I'm surrounded by all this stuff that I get for following and fulfilling my role so well, but I'm spiritually starving, and I'm miserable enough. Even though I've got more than plenty, I can't keep going on this way. It's just not meaningful enough, because I know there is more to me. You have a moment like that? It's God giving you permission to leave behind following the script of what you're supposed to do. You've learned the rules. You're responsible, so responsible you've been living other people's expectations of you, what other people need from you. Nothing wrong with any of it, but it's not where you need to be. Today, we have slips of paper. You can write down some of the things that you just need to burn up from last year. Sometimes we aren't even quite sure where we're actually headed next, but what we do know is we need to burn up some stuff from the past, cut the bridge from what we've been doing, and move into a different space. And you know what your personal stuff is in all likelihood. And while we're at it, how about a few social things that we could burn up as well, because we sure need to get past some of the worst headlines from last year, like the shooting at Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, that left 17 students dead, or the Tree of Life Synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh that left 11 dead. You know, there were 36 school shootings last year. Over 40,000 people died from gun violence, the same number of people who died from auto accidents. Simply an astonishing number and unacceptable. We could burn that up. And I wish we could leave behind all the chemical weapons attacks like the one in Ghouta province in Syria last year. And close to my family, as it is to so many, I wish we could burn up the opioid overdoses in our country. That scourge was up by 9.6% in 2018, and it took the lives of 47,000 of our neighbors and friends. It's so painful and unnecessary. Let's burn that up and let that go. And it seems like our generation is finally ready to burn up the ways of relating between men and women that led to the widespread phenomenon of the Me Too movement and the walk of shame that exposed so many men in power behaving badly. Let's burn that up too. And we're all slowly awakening to the need to get beyond climate weirding that gave us Hurricane Florence and Michael at an added cost, by the way, of $17 billion in damage. And the fires in Southern California that are estimated to cost us, or will cost us, between $7.5 and $10 billion. And we had floods on similar levels and destruction in Japan and Argentina, India, the Philippines, and China, and similar type of droughts in Europe, South Africa, and Australia. I'd like to burn all that up, and I bet you would too. May you be inspired also at the beginning of the new year to find the path towards genuine meaning. May you find where you really need to be, where your conscience is calling you to be, what you know you need to do in order to energize your spirit and live more deeply, what God wants you to become. Right now, that may just be an uncharted intuition that you can't even verbalize. Usually, it's like that. But we're blessed to live in a world where hopeful change is happening all around us, pointing in the higher direction towards the more noble parts of our souls. Maybe we can just name a couple of these things as well and release them to God positively. I think
of the hopeful things that happened last year, like we started using drones to deliver blood and medicine to rural Rwanda, using the most simple text messaging system, connecting the first world with the third world, most poorest regions of our world. Or the saltwater brewery. It started making six-pack rings, not out of plastic that ends up in the ocean as a threat to fish, but out of materials that turtles can eat. Or the French this year, who became the first country to ban supermarkets from throwing out leftover food, and now they have to have a plan to give it away to the poor. Or how about the 1.5 million volunteers in India that planted 66 million trees in just 12 hours, setting a world record in ecological restoration? Our world did see improvement in a number of ways that we should be grateful for. Breast cancer deaths fell by 39% because we're doing better research and making substantial progress. And smoking is at the lowest percentage ever in world history. Literacy is at an all-time high, and the poverty rate continues to fall for the poorest of the poor in our world at a faster rate than at any time in human history. And who could not give thanks for the photo from the House of Representatives this week? We had two Native American congressmen elected, both women, Sharice Davids of Kansas and Deb Haaland of New Mexico, who took the office for the first time in human and U.S. history that a Native American had actually become a congressman. It's about time. But it's also so inspiring because we're becoming more diverse, slowly but surely. Just look at the diversity that's growing and becoming, in the House of Representatives, more like our country actually is. How much better a world will be when we can all live free, expressing what's inside of us in a way that other people can celebrate. It is good. And it's not just out there somewhere. It's in you too. God has her hands on you. God is blessing you with hope and with love because you're beautiful and you're going to make a difference. That discontent that you feel because God is nudging you to stop just seeing what you're supposed to do, find out what you really need to do. And let all that passion that is welled up inside of you develop a creative outlet. Stop just existing and start living more abundantly. Amen.